Before the first egg went into the skillet, before a single lamp was lit, the pot on the stove had already been working for 30 minutes. That is not a story about unusual people. That is a story about a different kind of morning. Most of what filled those bowls has quietly disappeared, not because it was poor food, but because the world that required it changed. Fried mush, buckwheat cakes thick with sourness, potatoes left from last night's supper, bread too old to eat plain. One item on this list sounds like dessert. It was eaten before the barn. Stay until number 1. You will understand what we actually lost. Number 10. Fried cornmeal. Mush. The pot from supper did not get washed and forgotten. It got poured. Cornmeal mush, thick and warm from the evening meal, went into a loaf pan before the family went to bed. By morning, it had set cold and solid. You sliced it like bread, laid each piece into a skillet with hot lard, and waited. The edges turned brown and crackled before the center stopped trembling. That was when you knew. Nobody called this creative. The mush was already made. The lard was already rendered. The skillet was already there. One pot of cornmeal fed the family twice, and molasses poured into the crust made it something a working man could eat without complaint before heading into the cold. Restaurants now call the same grain polenta and charge accordingly. Here it was, yesterday's supper transformed into this morning's fuel. What ended it was simpler than any trend. When cold cereal came in a box and the morning shrank to 15 minutes, nobody poured mush into a pan the night before. The planning step disappeared first. The breakfast followed. In kitchens where nothing went to waste because waste had a visible cost, that planning never stopped. Number 9. Buckwheat pancakes with sorghum syrup. The batter sat on the counter overnight. By morning it smelled almost sharp. That sourness was the point. Buckwheat pancakes were not the soft weekend breakfast people know now. The batter carried a little yeast or a spoonful of sourdough starter, mixed with water or buttermilk, and left to ferment through the night. By morning it was alive, slightly tangy, ready. On the griddle, it spread dark and dense, chewier than white flour cakes, with a rough surface that held sorghum syrup in its pores. Buckwheat was grown locally across Pennsylvania and Ohio. Sorghum syrup was cheap, calorie-heavy, and already in the pantry. Together they made something that could carry a man through 4 hours of field work before he thought about food again. The light and fluffy pancake that replaced this was genuinely an improvement, in texture, in appearance, in speed. What it was not was fuel. When pancake mix arrived in a box, the overnight batter felt unnecessary. When sorghum syrup disappeared from most grocery stores, there was nothing left to pour over the top. The buckwheat pancake became a curiosity. The living batter that sat on the counter like something worth tending simply stopped being tended. The modern pancake is a dessert pretending to be breakfast. This one never pretended. Number 8. Fried potatoes and eggs. Leftover boiled potatoes from supper were not waste. They were planning. Before anyone stepped outside on a cold morning, cast iron was already heating on the stove. Cold potatoes, sliced or broken, went into the fat and were left alone long enough to develop a real crust. Onions, if the family used them, salt and pepper. Then eggs cracked directly into the spaces between the potatoes, whites going lacy at the edge while the yolk stayed soft. The grease and starch and egg smell filled the kitchen before there was full light outside. This required no recipe. It required a potato left from last night and someone awake early enough to cook it. That was it. Restaurants now call the same thing a hash and put a price on it that would have seemed absurd for yesterday's leftovers. Most families today do not boil potatoes with tomorrow's breakfast in mind. Frozen hash browns replaced the habit, and the drive-thru replaced the skillet entirely. If you ate this before 7, you did not need to think about food again until the work allowed it. Number 7. Scrapple butchering day came once a year, usually in November, and produced far more than roasts and hams. Scrapple was proof that nothing from that animal was wasted. Pork scraps, trimmings, and head meat were cooked down with broth, seasoned heavily with sage, black pepper, and salt, then mixed with cornmeal and packed into loaves to cool. Through winter, those loaves came out of the cold pantry, were sliced thin and fried in cast iron until the outside turned mahogany dark and the inside stayed soft. Served beside eggs or occasionally with a little syrup. The sage came through in every bite. The crust crackled. Scrapple appears in mid-Atlantic diners and some specialty shops today, but the homemade version from a freshly butchered hog was a different thing from what goes into a commercial package. The communal labor, the fresh broth, the specific seasoning, those disappeared when hog butchering left most American households, and the cuts involved became unfamiliar. In communities where hog butchering still takes place each autumn, scrapple making follows as naturally as it always did. Every slice was the butchering remembered, nothing wasted. Nothing forgotten. A man who had 3 hours of barn work behind him by 7 in the morning was not eating a big breakfast for pleasure. The body had already asked the question. The food was the answer. Number 6, corn cake. In some homes, this was Sunday's cornbread made thicker and fried on Monday morning. In others, it was made fresh. Either way, it held. Cornmeal went into a thick batter with egg, salt, lard, or butter, sometimes a little sour milk, and was cooked in a cast-iron skillet until the outside turned golden and the inside stayed pale and crumbly, dense enough to serve as bread and breakfast both, served with molasses or apple butter. Wheat flour was not always the cheapest thing in the pantry. Cornmeal was. The corn cake did the work wheat bread did, cost less to produce, and cooked fast enough for a busy morning. When leftover cornbread sat from the day before, frying it in butter was barely a decision. Once white flour became uniformly cheap and commercially sliced bread appeared on every shelf, cornbread moved toward dinner tables as a side. The fried morning version quietly retired. Nobody announced its departure. Cheap did not mean lesser. It meant the farm was not waiting on a supply chain. Number 5, fried smearcase. Smearcase was what we called cottage cheese. Fried smearcase was something else entirely, something most people dismiss before they ever try it. In dairy households, fresh curds were made regularly, thick, dense, nothing like the wet commercial product in plastic tubs. Those curds could be drained, shaped into small patties, and fried in butter until the outside turned golden and firm, while the inside stayed soft and mild, served plain or with a small amount of molasses. The outside of a well-fried smearcase patty has a delicate golden crust. The inside is creamy in a way the commercial version never achieves because it is not the same food. When store-bought cottage cheese replaced fresh curds in most households, the wet texture made frying impossible. The technique didn't survive the ingredient change. In homes with dairy cows, where fresh curds still drain in cheesecloth on an ordinary afternoon, fried smearcase never required an explanation. Most people have only ever eaten the commercial version. That is not the same food. Dairy, grain, and yesterday's supper. Those were the 3 pillars of a working breakfast, not because they were fashionable, because they were already there. Number 4, sour milk pancakes. Sour milk was not spoiled milk. It was milk that had done something useful, and throwing it away would have been a different kind of waste entirely. Raw whole milk left for a day too long would thicken and sour naturally. Mixed with flour, egg, a little salt, and baking soda, it became a pancake batter that needed nothing else. The acid in the milk reacted with the baking soda and the cakes lifted on their own. Tangier than a standard pancake, denser, golden-edged, with a slight sourness that came through even under syrup. The flavor had a function. The sourness was not a flaw. It told you the milk had gone further than drinking, but not past using. Buttermilk pancakes preserved some of this tradition in recipe form. What disappeared was the original logic, the knowledge that a quart sitting 1 day past fresh was not a loss, but a different ingredient. Pasteurized, homogenized milk does not behave the same way raw milk does, so the old technique no longer works the same way in most modern kitchens. The step was eliminated before most people had reason to miss it. If you understood what sour milk could do, you never poured it out. Number 3, bread soup. People call this poor people food with a tone that says they have never been cold and hungry at 5:30 in the morning with chores still ahead. Stale bread, the heel, the end slice, whatever had hardened overnight, was torn into a bowl. Warm whole milk was poured over it, sometimes with a little sugar or molasses, sometimes a small piece of butter. The bread softened from dry and crumbly into something silky and gentle, warm enough to heat the hands holding the bowl, sweet enough to make children eat without complaint before heading outside. This required no fire beyond what was already going to warm the kitchen. It required no skill. It required a piece of bread that would otherwise have been thrown away and a ladle of warm milk. French onion soup uses the same logic. Ribbolita uses the same logic. Both appear on restaurant menus without apology. Bread soaked in warm liquid is ancient kitchen intelligence. When commercially sliced bread arrived, it staled differently. When cold cereal came in decorated boxes, the bowl of warm milk and torn bread seemed old-fashioned rather than practical. The habit simply ceased to be necessary, so it stopped. A bowl of warm milk and yesterday's bread kept children through winters most modern people have not experienced. That is not nothing. We talk about food waste now as though it is a new idea. It was not a new idea. It was a kitchen rule. The bread was not garbage. The milk was not garbage. The leftover oatmeal was not garbage. Wasting food had a cost you could see. Number 2, rivvel soup. Rivvels are the small dough drops that fall from your fingers when you pinch flour and egg together over a pot of hot milk. No tool, no rolling, no instruction that a card could fully capture, just hands. Flour and egg rubbed together between the palms until the dough broke into rough crumbles, irregular, slightly chewy, plainly made. Dropped into boiling whole milk, they cooked in minutes. The milk version was sweet enough for children before school. A broth version with ham or chicken stock made a warm supper or a recovery meal for someone sick. Rivvel soup is documented Pennsylvania Dutch cooking. The word comes from the German rivvel, to crumble. The technique lived in the hands of the cook who made it, not in any written instruction. There is no commercial version of this. No box, no frozen package, no restaurant menu with rivvels on it. It did not survive in any form outside the households that kept making it because nothing about it could be standardized. Packaged cereal and instant oatmeal removed the time. The technique required hands that knew the motion. When the hands stopped, no recipe card was enough to restart them. There is no box version of this. No frozen version. If you want rivvel soup, someone has to know how to make it. A recipe card can list the ingredients. It cannot tell you how firm the rivvels should feel when they float, or how long to crumble, or when to stop. That knowledge lived in the hands. When the hands stopped making it, the card was not enough. Number 1. Steel-cut oat porridge with lard and salt. This was not a recipe anyone showed off. It was not made for guests. It was the breakfast that said the work today is serious, and the food has to match it. The pot went on the stove before anyone else was awake. Steel-cut oats, coarse ground, whole grain, cooked slowly in water or milk for 30 minutes, stirring occasionally, thickening into something almost resistant when you press the spoon through it. Then a spoonful of rendered lard or butter worked in, and coarse salt. Sometimes a thread of molasses for a family with children. That was all. The texture was nothing like instant oatmeal, thick enough to hold its shape briefly in the bowl, faintly nutty from the grain. The lard added a savory depth that no brown sugar packet achieves. Steam rose off the bowl, and the bowl sat solid in the hand. It was not pretty. It was not sweet. It held a working body from before sunrise until the middle of the day without asking anything further. Instant oatmeal arrived in the 1960s and solved the 30-minute problem. Brown sugar packets replaced the lard and salt. The quick version kept the name and the category and changed everything underneath. Lard was rebranded as unhealthy. Stone-ground oats were replaced by rolled flakes that cooked in 2 minutes. The sticking power, the density, the long, slow calories, those went with them. In a kitchen without a microwave, where the stove was already lit before anyone dressed, and the morning started early enough to tend a pot, nothing about this was inconvenient. The oatmeal cooked while the chores waited. The bowl was ready when the hands came back inside. The instant version kept the name. It did not keep the job. That pot on the stove is mostly empty now. The wooden spoon rests across the rim. Morning light is just beginning on the kitchen window, and the boots by the door are already gone. These were not unusual breakfasts. They were ordinary ones, the kind built from what the farm produced, what the pantry held, what last night left behind. The knowledge that made them came from watching someone else's hands, not from a card on the wall. When you leave a comment below, tell me which one your mother made, or your grandmother, or your father before the rest of the house was up. Tell me the one nobody wrote down. Some of the best recipes I have ever heard came from exactly that kind of remembering.